What time is it in Spain?
It's probably really late.
It's
So
really
we
late.
have like two people, and then most of them will tune in tomorrow.
You speak Spanish?
No.
6, yeah. Same as
Yeah,
Germany,
Tuesdays.
but not Portugal.
Mm-hmm. Do you
Okay.
have sound too?
You have this? Is this going on here?
All right.
Okay.
Okay. So I think we're going to get started with the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
My mic. Testing.
Just want to get
Do we have sound now? Testing. There we go. All right. So like I said, for Q&A, we're going to use the microphone just for the benefit of our live streaming audience. I'm not going to give Woody too much of an introduction. Since you just saw the film, you kind of saw a bit about him. But not only did he study with Gary Davis, so you could ask him some questions about that experience, but he also teaches here at Berkeley. And I hope you'll give us a little bit better an idea of what you teach and what classes, so we can
Absolutely.
promote that.
Yeah. Thank you, Erica. So yeah, thanks for watching the movie, and thanks. I appreciate it. It was a labor of love. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and you know, like I said, he was my teacher as a kid, so kind of the movie started where I had many hours of my tapes of my lessons, and that was kind of the. I've always thought it was over the years it was a story that needed to be told because, you know, as I grew older and I stopped playing his music, and you kind of got lost in the history books. And so when I found my tapes after years, I said, you know, this would be a nice story to tell. And so, long story short, we got some funding and got Trevor Lawrence, a great director, and Dan Gold, the cinematographer, and we got together and just sort of evolved from there. So, but it really feels good to just have his story out. And I think, you know, with Davis, as great a musician as he was and influential as he was, you know, he gets lost in the history books in a lot of ways because he didn't quite fit in, you know. He wasn't a straight blues player. He wasn't a straight gospel player. So he didn't quite fit into what the historians, you know, into their niches. So he always got lost in the blues history books or in the Roots Americana books. He was a footnote, blind Gary Davis from the Carolinas. So, you know, I think that's the problem with history books in some ways and with unique artists like someone like Davis. And that's why, you know, to me, he's really one of the unique American artists, and you know, we don't really know how he developed his style or who he influenced. And what was interesting about him, since he wasn't a blues player, he didn't really influence a lot of other people because his music was more religious when he started, you know, turning from blues to religion and things. And yeah, I think because of he walked the streets for many years. He played dances, he played the tobacco warehouses, he played in churches. So his repertoire covered a wide range of novelty songs, spiritual songs, blues songs, you know, which is also very unique with a lot of the old musicians. They were either blues artists or gospel. Davis kind of cut across all. And even when I was a kid, I remember meeting some of the old blues guys like Son House and Booker White, and they were tough guys, and they were not forthcoming with teaching me guitar because blues guys were tough guys. You know, and Davis was a churchy man. He was he loved teaching. He was proud to be a teacher. So it was a whole different tradition than the blues tradition. And I think that's why he kind of got lost in sort of the American history pantheon kind of thing. So anyway, it just feels good to get his story out there and hopefully, you know, turn a lot of people on to his music. And when we started the project, I didn't want to make a project that's kind of preaching to the choir. Those of us who know Davis and love him, we know we could just throw his music up there and that's the whole movie. But hopefully, you know, it's to turn people on to who are maybe not familiar with his music and discover his music, and that's kind of what it was about. So, I don't know, anybody has any questions? I can go on for hours and talk about it, but, you know, yeah, sure.
Well, first I want to thank you,
Thank you.
for doing the film. It's
Sure.
really fantastic, especially to be able to see some of the old clips of him playing.
Yes.
Which is really wonderful that they exist.
Right.
And that you found them and put them all together.
Right. There's some new footage. The Newport footage is the first time. Actually, we premiered the film in New York on Sunday, and so that's the first time that footage has been seen. The Newport footage, yeah, and the Peter, Paul, and Mary as well. All that footage from Newport was just recently discovered. So.
I have a really great record that came out a couple of years ago by Marie Knight, who
Yes.
did a lot of
Yes.
performing and recording with Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Yep.
And the whole album is songs
Terrific.
from Reverend Gary Davis.
Right.
And but I don't know how many songs he wrote. I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of it in the film.
Right.
And I've never seen any of the records that you showed.
Of Davis? Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know if those are all his originals or is
Right.
he covering other people's. That's basically my question.
Sometimes it's a great, yeah, sometimes it's a great, Marie Knight, Dave Keyes, who's the piano player in the movie, he toured with Marie Knight, so he's very familiar with her and Davis' material. But Davis' material, sometimes you don't know if he wrote the song or he adapted a traditional song. Like according to his publisher, he wrote a lot of songs that he probably didn't write. They're just traditional songs. But there are some that he did write. So it's kind of a gray area. So tunes like Hesitation Blues, which was recorded by Jelly Roll Morton, it's kind of traditional blues, but it's now attributed to Gary Davis. Or Candyman. These were novelty songs that he might have picked up in the Carolinas that he sort of adapted and recorded. So it became known as a Gary Davis song. And the same thing with some of his spiritual tunes. He'd play a song and I'd say, "Where'd that come from?" And he said, many times, like he'd say, "Well, God gave it to me. The Lord just taught it to me." So I say, "Yeah, but where'd you really learn it?" So he had this way of adapting material. And some things he actually did write. Some of the lyrics he wrote, like "Destruction in This Land," I believe is one of his, and "Death Don't Have No Mercy." So there's quite a bit. But if you look at his discography and the publisher list, there's like, 40, 50 songs that he wrote. And his albums, the interesting thing to do in the film, he was one of those artists, he was alive, in the 60s and 70s. And he was, in my opinion, he was over-recorded. Because he was an old man at the time, and he was tired. And a lot of his last recordings are not really great, but he did it because he needed the money. And it was just recording. And so, his early recordings are, out of his 400 songs output, there's some really fantastic material. And I think that's the one thing about Davis. A lot of times when people first hear his music, they find it very gruff and very, it's rough around the edges. It's not sexy music in a way, in terms of like Robert Johnson or a lot of the blues guys. And sometimes his guitar is a little out of tune, and he's very, rough and tumble. And it's, and I think you have to listen to certain recordings of his are better than others in terms of getting the message across. I think that's one of the downfalls of Davis's discography. He was just over-recorded, And with a lot of the blues artists and a lot of the early masters, we only have like a dozen or so recordings, and that's their legacy. I think if we took Davis's recordings and distilled it down to his great 25 tunes, it'd be incredible. But again, there's a lot of stuff out there. So with Davis, you kind of have to sift through it. But he had, like I said, he had a whole breadth of repertoire. He had like the novelty sides. So some of his records are just ragtime instrumentals. Some of them are kind of fire and brimstone gospel, scream and shouting. Some are folk songs, ragtime. So he had you really had to study his music. He's really a musician with a lot of musical depth. Oh yeah.
That whole thing was snapping his fingers
Oh,
and
yeah.
stopping and just
Isn't that great?
Yeah, he was
I know.
totally improvising.
I know.
And you could just tell, well, he was doing what the Spirit told him to do.
I know.
It was so fantastic.
I know.
That's the best.
Yeah. I mean, he played, and he always, like even at his house when I took a lesson, I'd ask him for a song, and I'd say, and I wanted to learn the guitar stuff. I wasn't into the religious aspect of it. I was learning fingerstyle folk guitar, and I wanted to learn his songs. So I'd go to his house. I'd say, can you teach me this song? And all I wanted to learn is the licks, but he would launch into the song and start doing all 20 verses, shouting and screaming, and I just said, no, just give me the licks and stuff, But to him, it was music. Music was part of what he did. He didn't practice, he played. He didn't noodle on the guitar. And even the lessons in the house, like we'd have the lesson right near the front door. We didn't have a music room. So the lessons were, constantly being interrupted, and Annie'd be in the kitchen cooking, or the guy mowing the lawn would start singing along with Davis. So the music was like the central part of the house. So music was just, for me as a kid, it was a great experience because, it wasn't about performing. The music meant something else. It wasn't about, it was about the music, and that's what really struck me in the house. And I think that's the way he approached music. So when he taught me a song, it wasn't just like, let's noodle on the guitar. It's like, let's play it. It'd be like 2 hours of the whole song. So it was a great lesson. And like I said, he was the real deal. I mean, imagine walking the streets, And there's a whole period of his life, like in the 50s, 40s, 50s, we don't know where he was. He moved from Durham to New York, but there's a blank period of like 15 years where we don't know. Where was he living, walking the streets? How was he surviving? You know, we have a few of his, from Durham, some of the social worker um, sheets, her log, but that's all we know, that he was on social services like in Durham. But when he came to New York until the 50s, when John Cohn saw him, and you know, then late 50s, early 60s with the folk revival, that's when he started gaining some notoriety. But like in the 40s, I'd say from 1940 to 55, we don't know. So it's just amazing that he survived, you know. And as Barry said in the movie, it's, you know, he never complained. He never was bitter. He wasn't like, you know, he wanted more fame or this guy was better than him. It was never like that. He was just happy with what he had. He loved playing music and was just, you know, if he had food in his plate and God will provide, and let's just play music. So it was a totally different approach than the pro musician that, you know, of having a career. He was just happy to play. And that struck me, in doing the movie, that kind of struck me in retrospect. At the time, I didn't really appreciate it. But now looking back, that's one aspect I really appreciate. Here's a guy, you know, and we're all trying to play music and trying to make it meaningful in our lives. And, you know, here's a guy that had nothing. And all he did was play guitar and got better. And as he grew older, he grew happier. And even though he had no money, he was totally cool. I mean, there's a great lesson there. So that's, at least I'm learning that. You always learn that lesson, so, yeah. But
Just to say, if you wanted to dig in on some of the CDs, I don't know, you were saying some
Sure.
are better than others, and I'm not sure which ones we have, but
sure.
on the back of the blue sheets,
Yeah.
a good number of those are the Gary Davis albums that we
Right.
happen to have. So
Sure.
if you
Yeah,
wanted
I'd
to
say-
start
Sure.
digging in, you could do it there.
No, absolutely. There's a few from the early 60s. One I think, there's one Bible is called Harlem Street Singer. Can't forget that title. So there you go. That's the name of the album, Harlem Street Singer. If you get that, that's where you want to start. That's his classic religious, where he does all his hits. And then there's another one called Guitar and Banjo, which is his instrumentals. And I think if you have those two, that's your starter kit. You know, you have all sides of Gary Davis. And that's when he was at his prime. He was on the streets, and he really plays with a lot of fire, and he's really on top of his game. And you know, those are great. Yeah.
As we've seen in the movie, he made like extensive use of not only a thumb pick but also like a metal finger pick.
Right.
Was that coming from like a banjo tradition, or did he ever like touch on that during the lessons? Or
Yeah, he played with the thumb pick and a finger pick. And when I studied with him, I used that too, just to be heard, because he was so loud. You know, so I used to stick those on my fingers too. But I think that was his, I think partly because of volume, and he always played with two fingers, and he just adapted that style, and he just developed it that way. And it didn't hinder him at all in terms of the sound he got. And he played one of those guitars that was a J200, where you really had to play with a lot of power to get a sound. So he played very hard. You know, he played very fluid, but also very hard. And so he just had that really punchy, loud sound. And obviously that's from playing the streets, playing in churches. Like he'd play to a congregation, and he'd sit up there with his guitar, so he'd have to be heard. And there was no amplification, and you saw even in Newport, it was just the old microphone. So there was no pickups and none of that. So volume was the tradition, which is not something we think of today with electric guitars and stuff. But back then, it's all about acoustics, how to project, and the singing too. That's true for Son House and the Blues Singers. It's all about projection and getting your voice out there, and you know that's part of the music. I think his style developed probably with the finger picks, getting that sound. You know.
but he never used more than like, it was really like just two fingers.
Yeah, like he said in the movie, I used to say, "How come you only use two fingers?" He says, "Because that's all you need." Okay, you know, yeah, and I think also, you know, like all musicians, your music develops out of need in a way. Like his music, his repertoire developed out of need. Like if you're a street musician, someone comes up and say, "Hey, can you play the Star Spangled Banner? Here's $1." You go, "Okay," and you come up with some half-big version of it. Or if you know, whatever you say yes, you know, and you play it. So you come up with this repertoire. Even if you don't know it, you come up with a version of it, that kind of thing. And the same thing in church with all the spirituals. And when he walked the streets, you know, he held his guitar a certain way, because not to bump the guitar. So even when he was teaching me, he'd sit in a big easy chair. So the guitar would be like this, and he'd sit back. So he'd have these really funny ways. And I think that might have had something to do with the finger picks, the way he played. I don't really know. That's what struck me. I have all these tapes of my lessons, but I never thought to interview him. I never asked him these questions because I was a kid. I never asked him, like, how many kids do you have? Where are you from? Why do you play that way? So you just don't think of that at the time, so. But he definitely had his unique way of playing.
Did you play banjo before you started playing guitar?
Yeah, before guitar. I never heard him play banjo, but he had a 6-string banjo, so it's just basically a guitar. Yeah, it's a guitar, So, but
Did anyone interview him?
the only one we have in the movie, I have a little bit of interview from Stefan Grossman. Yeah, and Stefan was a great help in the movie. He's a good friend, and he had a lot of material. And he was with Davis before I was, and he actually took lessons like I did, has a lot of tapes of his lessons, and a few interviews. And he gave me all the interviews, and that was cut up from many. So it's interviews, but they were kind of freewheeling. So I edited them down.
Audio, right?
Just audio.
Oh, that's right.
I know.
So that's where that came
Exactly. No, there's no early footage. It's incredible, isn't it? Pete Seeger Show is the only footage we have. And in the 60s, Seattle Folklore Center and a few, the clips you saw of him playing Pete Seeger Show, all those other clips were done in the 60s. And then we discovered a few clips from Canada in the 50s, but the audio was out of sync, and that was me playing, just syncing it up. Just a few clips that was not discovered before. And then the Newport, and that's all. And there probably is, now that the movie's out, and we've been searching everywhere for footage from BBC. I know BBC has some, but they can't find it. So I'm sure something will surface. But this Murray Lerner footage from the Newport Festival was a big find. That's like, the best footage of Davis, really, in terms of quality and sound and stuff. So, but you never know. I'm sure something's going to come up, but everybody was just very helpful with the film, donating their time. Bob Ware and Yorma and all these people and stuff. And yeah. And there's a lot of other people that we tried to get in the film that were no longer with us. We tried, but we started the production. But I'm really happy with the results, and it is, I think we have, it tells, at least touches on different parts of Davis's life and stuff. But yeah.
You said you had tapes of recordings of lessons. You and
Yeah.
Grossman, have you guys considered doing anything with it?
Yeah, not to release it. I mean, I play it at workshops for students because I think it's nice for students to hear. There was no mystery. It wasn't like I was a great player. Anybody could learn if someone's sitting there for 3 hours, do this. It's just drill, drill, drill. So it's good. I play it at workshops, but I thought about releasing it, but no reason to. I mean, there's no estate. Annie's not with us anymore. His whole family thing is not happening. So, and I don't want to make money off it. So it's just nice to have for students, and you know what I mean, that kind of thing. Oh yeah, I'll probably give it. Yeah, maybe something like that someday. Give it to Smithsonian.
Donate
give it
it to the Berkeley
Sure.
Archive.
Or
It's
give
a
it to
new
the
archive. It's a year
Yeah,
old.
yeah. Give it to the Berkeley Archive. Something like that. Be perfect. Sure, because it's really fun. I mean, it's 60 hours, so it has to be edited down. And a lot of it, like I said, I'd bring my old reel-to-reel near the front door. And if the lessons were interrupted, I'd let the tape run. So it'd be like 3 hours of blank on the tape, and him talking on the phone for 2 hours. So it has to be edited down. But there's a lot of great material that he didn't record, that's on the tapes. But to me, the beauty of it was just, it was really old school teaching. Just he was very patient, and that's why, again, with the old blues guys that I met who were still alive at the time, they didn't teach that way. They weren't. The blues tradition wasn't to share your music. Let's put it mildly, It was, but Davis was very proud to carry on the tradition.
How much did he charge you?
$5 for a whole day. I mean, I don't think I had a lesson less than 3-4 hours. Yeah. Yeah, we'd sit there and just all day, and I'd be the one to leave the lessons, because he'd be like, he had nothing better to do than play. And I met him when he was off the streets, and he had that last few years of his life when he had a modicum of success, and he was doing the coffee house circuit. So he was, getting well known in a way. So I didn't know him when he was walking the streets, So he would just love to sit and play. Here's another song, and I go, I got to go now. My hands hurt. You know, it's like, you know, but he's very kind, very just incredible. Listen to the tapes. It's amazing how patient he was. I mean, I wouldn't have that kind of patience, you know. But he loved to teach. He's, you know, I'm your teacher now. Let me hear you play that song I taught you. You know, play, that sounds pretty good. Oh, play, no, it goes like this. He just loved it, you know. It was just extraordinary. And I think that was part of also his message of the church. Every time he did a gig, he'd see it as a congregation. He'd preach to the audience. So a typical Davis concert would be, he'd slip into a religious tune, then he'd do a novelty tune. And he wouldn't do a blues, but he'd do kind of a funny blues. Like he never play blues. Blues was the devil's music. It wasn't allowed in the house. But he would play like hesitation blues, which is kind of funny. So he would do those kind of blues, but not like the old, real hardcore blues things. I never could figure out where the differentiation was, but there was to him. You know, so a typical concert, he'd be, you know, do a funny song and then have the audience laughing. Then the next song would be like preaching to him. So he just saw every gig as his congregation, you know, which is actually kind of a cool way of looking at it, in music and stuff. So, yeah.
Did he have any contemporaries that he would play that would want to jam with him, or?
Not that I knew, no. I mean, I know he recorded with Sonny Terry and a few others, but as far as I know, he was a solo act, and I never saw him play with anybody. Yeah, yeah. And he really didn't. I'd ask him about other musicians. He never had a kind word to say about them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, blues guy. He didn't have patience. See, I think the whole thing with blues was not, you know, that was the devil's music, and he was a preacher now. And that's, you know, back then you were either a blues person or a church person. And basically, if you were a blues man, you were an outcast from society. You were not. It wasn't good to be a blues person, you know, like it is today. You know, where we play blues, which is, you know, back then it was a bad thing. So I think to him it was like, you know, every time I bring up, what do you think of Blind Lemon Jefferson, or what do you think of Charlie Patton? He'd be like, oh, he just wouldn't talk about it, you know. So the only person he said something nice about would be like Blind Blake, or Willie Walker, and those are more ragtime players, so they weren't really. Yeah, he didn't. Yeah, I mentioned him to him, but he didn't have much to say about him. You know, yeah. But I remember, again, I never really interviewed him. I look back at him. I could, you know, you can kick yourself for not doing that. There's so many questions I had from doing the movie, and I listened to all the tapes, and the tapes is just music and laughing and playing, but not once did I, you know. I think I was intimidated. Obviously, I was a kid, so you're not going to. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, he would tell me stories that were like over my head. Yeah, you know, and I'd go to, you know, problems with school and stuff, and his advice wasn't. Yeah, exactly. His advice wasn't the best advice, I think. Yeah.
I think
But it
we
was
can
great.
probably do one more
Yeah,
question
sure.
if somebody wants
Sure.
to jump in.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
This might be slightly redundant. He didn't happen to have an opinion of Blind Willie McTell, did he?
No, not that I know of.
Huh.
No. No. No.
We'll put one more out on the floor.
Yeah. No, with other musicians, I know he never really had a kind word, and that's why, you know, even with his style, it's like we don't know really how he developed it. And I think, you know, for the musicians, we're all musicians here, which is kind of cool in a way, because, you know, he developed this kind of melodic approach to playing, and it would be like a chord melody, like a jazz player would take a melody, a tune, play a melody, and do a chord melody, and that's kind of what Davis did. And so when he would teach a congregation, he wouldn't just strum the chords, do like the old finger picking, where the vocal would be the vocal line and the guitar would be the accompaniment. The guitar was actually the vocal line. So whatever he was singing, he'd be, you know, playing on the guitar. So he developed this very sophisticated way of playing, where he'd play, even if it's just a 3-chord song, he'd play all the chords in all different positions. So he'd play this beautifully intricate, arranged chord melody, which nobody did back then. I mean, nobody does then or since then. And yet his vocabulary was very rootsy. It wasn't like, you know, jazz chords, but it was very sophisticated chord melody, like it really was a jazz approach. So I think he developed his style because he wanted to teach the song to the congregation, or he was, you know, singing on the streets where he'd say to the guitar, talk to me, and the guitar would talk because maybe his voice got tired and he played the melody on the guitar. So who knows how it developed, but it developed definitely out of this necessity, this need that the guitar had to talk. The guitar had to play the melody. And that was a pretty cool thing. It wasn't just like these arrangements that came out of nowhere. So when I learned his music, at the time I didn't know what I was learning. I was just doing it by rote. But later on I realized, oh, this is a cool approach to understanding the keyboard, the fingerboard. So now in my teaching, I use the way he taught me by trying to understand it and teach it. Although he didn't understand it himself. He just did it, just do this, I asked him once, I said, how do you write a song? And thinking I was waiting for this profound answer, like, how do you write a song? I mean, what's your motivation, whatever. He said, and I'll never forget, he says, well, first you take the whole notes, then you take the half notes, then you take the rests, and you put it together. That was it. I said, okay. To him, it just came to him. It's a different approach, but anyway.
Speaking of teaching,
Yes.
what are you teaching here currently?
Yes, I'm here as part of the, I guess the umbrella in the Roots program, as part of the Country Blues. There's a Country Blues visiting artist with me and Paul Rochelle are teaching here at Berkeley, and really excited about it. And so, part of obviously what I teach, Davis is always filtered through, what I teach. And it's basically country blues and, how to take the country blues and how to, to me, it's a craft. It's not just an old folk art. It's like jazz. It's a craft, and learn the guitar, and you could use the materials in that for your own music, for songwriting, for jazz playing, for improvising. So, trying to really, to me, country blues, it's an art form, and that's what we're trying to do here at Berkeley, teach it and bring it into the guitar department, the Roots. So it's very cool. It's been really receptive, and it's great working with the students here who are like jazz majors and now talking about the blues and approaches to improvising, playing off the melody, things like that. So it's cool to see how it's morphing. So I'm very excited about being here. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Woody.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks for setting this up. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Yeah.
Out to Spain?
What time is it in Spain?
It's probably really late.
It's really late.
Like 2 people, and then most of them will tune in tomorrow.
You speak Spanish? 6, yeah. Same as Germany, but not Portugal. Okay. Always thought it was, over the years, it was a story that needed to be told because, as I grew older and I stopped playing his music, and you kind of got lost in the history books. And so when I found my tapes after years, I said, this would be a nice story to tell. And so, long story short, we got some funding and got Trevor Lawrence, a great director, and Dan Gold, the cinematographer, and we got together and just sort of evolved from there. So, but it really feels good to just have his story out. And I think, with Davis, as great a musician as he was and influential as he was, he gets lost in the history books in a lot of ways because...
Bit about him. But not only did he study with Gary Davis, so you could ask him some questions about that experience, but he also teaches here at Berkeley. And I hope you'll give us a little bit better an idea of what you teach and what classes,
Sure.
so we can
Absolutely.
promote that.
Yeah. Thank you, Erica. So, yeah, thanks for watching the movie, and thanks. I appreciate it. It was a labor of love. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and, like I said, he was my teacher as a kid, so kind of the movie started where I had many hours of my tapes of my lessons, and that was kind of he didn't quite fit in, He wasn't a straight blues player. He wasn't a straight gospel player. So he didn't quite fit into what the historians, into their niches. So he always got lost in the blues history books or in the Roots Americana books. He was a footnote, blind Gary Davis from the Carolinas. So, I think that's the problem with history books in some ways, and with unique artists like someone like Davis. And that's why, to me, he's really one of the unique American artists. And we don't really know how he developed his style or who he influenced. And what was interesting about him, since he wasn't, you have this? Is this going on here?
All right.
Okay.
Okay. So I think we're going to get started with the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
My mic. Testing.
I just want to get
Do we have sound now? Testing. There we go. All right. So like I said, for Q&A, we're going to use the microphone just for the benefit of our live streaming audience. I'm not going to give Woody too much of an introduction since you just saw the film. You kind of
Yeah.
saw a